Most descriptions of the Human Instrumentality project treat it as a transhumanist thought experiment, a sci-fi premise about merging all human consciousness into a single entity. What if that framing is exactly backwards? What if the most disturbing idea in Neon Genesis Evangelion isn't some far-future technology, but something you might have experienced yourself on the worst morning you can remember, the wish to simply stop being yourself? Neon Genesis Evangelion aired in 1995, created by Hideaki Anno during a severe depressive episode. It begins as a mecha show about teenagers fighting alien angels and becomes something much stranger, a story about why human beings hurt each other simply by existing as separate selves. The Human Instrumentality project is the engine driving the plot. SEAL, the shadowy committee running an ERV, wants to dissolve the barriers between all human souls, merging everyone into a single unified entity. For 25 episodes, this is background lore. Then the show's final act makes it the entire story. Evangelion's cultural weight comes from this pivot from genre entertainment to something that feels like it's interrogating the viewer directly. And the key to understanding that pivot is understanding what instrumentality actually represents, because it is not what it appears to be. Here is the argument: the Human Instrumentality project is not a science fiction transcendence scheme but a concrete dramatization of the depressive experience. The fantasy of ego dissolution is escape from the pain of selfhood, which the series ultimately rejects by framing individual existence as worth the suffering it guarantees. 3 things need to be true for this to hold. First, the described mechanics of instrumentality need to map onto the documented experience of depressive dissociation. Second, the series needs to structure instrumentality as a subjective psychological state rather than an objective external event. Third, Shinji's rejection of instrumentality needs to function as the series' argument that the fantasy of ego death is a seductive lie, that liberation through self-annihilation is still annihilation. Start with the mechanics. The show establishes that feels are the barriers that maintain individual existence. The manga establishes this most explicitly through Rei and Kaworu's discussions, and the anime reinforces it in episode 24 when Kaworu explains that the field is the light of the soul, the barrier that separates one person from another. Remove the field, and you remove the boundary between selves. This is what instrumentality does. Now consider what depressive dissociation feels like: the erosion of the ego boundary, the sense that the border between you and the world is dissolving, the wish to stop being a separate entity who can experience pain. The mapping is precise. Instrumentality takes the depressive fantasy, "wouldn't it be easier not to be me anymore?" and literalizes it as a world historical event. But the series goes further than that. It doesn't just describe instrumentality as the removal of boundaries. It describes that removal as initially pleasurable. In End of Evangelion, during the merger sequence, characters experience their deepest wishes fulfilled. Misato sees Kaji. Asuka is finally held. Shinji is told that in this world, he cannot be hurt because there are no others to hurt him. This reading argues that this is the seduction of the depressive fantasy, the promise that dissolving the self will end suffering. And it does, by ending the self that can suffer. The series is honest about how appealing that feels. So what the text has shown at this point is that instrumentality's mechanics mirror depressive dissociation and that it presents the dissolution of self as relief, which means the series is setting up a choice, not a transformation. Now, the structure. The original final 2 episodes, 25 and 26, take place almost entirely inside Shinji's consciousness. There are no external events. There are no mecha battles. The world outside has, for all practical purposes, ended, but we don't see it. What we see is Shinji working through the question of whether he wants to exist as an individual. This is crucial. If instrumentality were genuinely an objective event, a real merger of all humanity happening in physical space, the series would need to show it happening. Instead, the series shows one person's experience of it, from the inside, as a psychological crisis. The director stated that the final episodes were shaped by budget constraints and his own depression, but the structural pattern is consistent regardless of production circumstances. Instrumentality is filmed as subjectivity. End of Evangelion confirms this while externalizing it. We see the physical merger. We see Rei become enormous. We see the red dots floating upward. But even here, the core of the sequence is Shinji's interior decision. He is asked whether he wants this. He chooses. The cosmic event is a backdrop for one person's psychological choice. The pattern suggests that the series understands instrumentality as fundamentally about the question it poses to Shinji: is existence as a separate self worth the pain? This is where you need to follow carefully, because the distinction matters. Depression does not present itself as depression. It presents itself as rationality. It says, the pain of being me is so overwhelming that ceasing to be me is the logical solution. It says, the boundaries between myself and the world are the source of my suffering, so removing those boundaries is freedom. Instrumentality says exactly the same thing, in exactly the same voice, which is why the series takes it so seriously. It is not a cartoon villain scheme. It is the most convincing argument depression has ever made. So the text has established that instrumentality maps onto the depressive wish, and the structure frames it as a subjective psychological crisis rather than an objective event, which means the resolution of that crisis is the series' answer to the question instrumentality poses. And the answer is no. Shinji rejects instrumentality. He chooses to return to a world where he can be hurt, where it fields exist, where the gap between himself and others guarantees both isolation and the possibility of connection. The original series ends with the famous congratulations scene, Shinji smiling, being told he has realized something important. What he has realized is that existing as an individual, even in pain, is preferable to the painless void of ego dissolution. End of Evangelion ends with him and Asuka on a beach, the world ruined, Asuka's bandaged body a testament to the reality of suffering, and he reaches out and touches her face, and she calls him disgusting. It is not a triumphant ending. It is a defeated ending. But it is an ending in which two people exist as separate selves, which is exactly what instrumentality tried to prevent. The series argues that the depressive fantasy is a lie. Not because the pain isn't real, it demonstrably is, but because the solution it offers is indistinguishable from death. The freedom of no boundaries is the freedom of non-existence. Shinji's choice is not optimism. It is simply the recognition that the alternative is nothing. Now consider the strongest reading against this. Instrumentality has genuine philosophical weight. It draws on Hegel's absolute spirit, Buddhist concepts of non-self, and traditions that argue the ego is a prison. Seal believes in it sincerely. It has coherent intellectual foundations. The series presents it as a real option with real stakes, not merely a psychological symptom. And Shinji's rejection is personal, one person's choice, not a universal argument. Reading instrumentality purely as depression risks reducing a genuine philosophical proposition to pathology. Maybe the text is presenting a real dilemma, not diagnosing a disorder. This counterargument has merit, but it cannot account for the series' structural choices. If instrumentality were genuinely a dilemma with two viable options, the text would need to present both options as livable. It doesn't. Every character who experiences instrumentality experiences it as either horror or void. The brief pleasure of boundary dissolution gives way to the loss of individual identity, and the series provides no vision of what existence in that state would look like beyond absence. The Hegelian absolute is supposed to be a higher synthesis, a reconciliation that preserves what was valuable in individual existence. Instrumentality offers no preservation. It offers only erasure. The Buddhist concept of non-self is a practice aimed at reducing attachment and suffering through insight, not at obliterating the empirical person. Instrumentality obliterates. The series is not subtle about this. When Shinji asks what will happen to him in Instrumentality, he is told, "You will vanish." This is not transcendence. It is disappearance. The philosophical tradition's Instrumentality resembles all preserve something, Instrumentality preserves nothing. That distinction is what makes it a depressive fantasy rather than a philosophical proposition. So, what follows if this reading is correct? It means that Neon Genesis Evangelion should be understood as fundamentally a work about depression and the refusal of the escape it offers. The sci-fi apparatus Angels, Evius, Lance of Longinus, Dead Sea Scrolls is a vehicle for exploring something psychologically specific, not the other way around. Anna was working through his own experience of the wish to dissolve and arriving at a conclusion. The wish is comprehensible, even sympathetic, but it is ultimately a lie dressed as liberation. The work's enduring relevance comes from how precisely it captures that fantasy and how honestly it rejects it. And this reframes the entire series. Every character's coping mechanism, Misato's self-destructive sexuality, Asuka's aggression, Rei's passivity, Gendo's manipulation, is a different strategy for surviving the pain of existing as a separate self. Instrumentality is the fantasy that none of those strategies are necessary because the problem itself, separate existence, can be eliminated. The series says, no. The problem cannot be eliminated. You can only choose to keep living with it. Here is a mental model you can apply beyond this work. When a narrative presents ego dissolution as a literal plot device, ask whether it is being offered as transcendence or exposed as escape. The difference is not subtle. Transcendence preserves something of what it transforms, escape preserves nothing. A work that romanticizes self-annihilation will frame dissolution as arrival. A work that warns against it will frame dissolution as seduction followed by absence. Evangelion does the latter, and the question it leaves you with is not whether instrumentality is desirable, that answer is in the text. The question is, what do you call the part of yourself that already wants it, and what would it take for you to refuse it too?